Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Jones, and I'm going to give you a quick talk on the 3 things that are absolutely critical for any COVID ventilator design. Now, what I mean by a COVID ventilator design is really one of these, I'm going to use the term do-it-yourself designs, that are really meant to be ventilators of last resort. That is, if you don't have a proper medical ventilator available, hopefully one of these designs will be good enough and easy enough to produce that will be helpful in saving a number of lives around the world. Now, why am I talking about something like this? Well, my little group has actually been working on one of these ventilators, and we've learned a whole bunch of things over the last 2.5 weeks or so. My own area of expertise is engineering. I have a PhD in engineering, so I'm not a medical doctor. And the first thing I do want to point out is if you are working on a ventilator of this nature, you really do need a medical doctor or some sort of healthcare professional as part of your team or as a resource, because there are a lot of things that those people know that you probably wouldn't know simply from looking at specifications of things. So, with that in mind, what are the 3 critical things that any of these ventilators must have? And the first one is, it must help. And what I mean by that is, it must help sustain a life. There are a few other corollaries, such as it must do no harm. The second thing is, it must be reliable. Why is that important? Well, you would certainly be risking somebody's life if it was not reliable. The other thing is, if it is not reliable, you might spend more and more time fixing ventilators rather than making more ventilators. Finally, it must be easy to build. Why is that critical? Well, if it's hard to build or uses exotic parts that are very hard to get and have long lead times, there's no point in building one of these ventilators at all. You might as well be building a proper, full-fledged, modern, computerized ventilator, because after all, that's the gold standard. What inspired me to do this talk is so many of the designs out there seem to be failing in one or more of these things. Not really through any fault of the designers, but possibly because they're not necessarily thinking about those things. So what I'm going to do now is talk about each one of those things in a little bit more detail. The first thing we want to talk about is the it must help point. A very critical one. And again, and do no harm. And that is critical for a number of reasons. The first thing is the human lung is in fact very susceptible to overpressure or barotrauma. Ask any scuba diver that. That's the first thing they teach scuba diver, is the dangers of compressed air from your scuba tank in your lung and how to avoid it when you're ascending to the surface. The same thing applies to ventilators. You have to be very careful about the air pressures and tidal volumes you put into a human lung. Get it wrong, and you risk doing way more harm than good, or even seriously injuring the person. And what that sort of brings is one of the points that a lot of ventilators are missing. You need to really be able to adjust various things like tidal volume and pressures as presented to the patient. They need to be adjusted on a per person basis, apparently, by the medical professionals. The other thing that, of course, you need to be able to adjust is the breathing rate. That is all critical, again, based on the person and their particular situation. Modern ventilators apparently have all sorts of sensors that can sense when the person is trying to breathe, and if so, then the ventilator helps them. The simpler ventilators that we're working on right now, taking inspiration from some of the first ventilators in the 1950s or 60s, just have a set breathing rate. which is not nearly as good, but again may fall into the category of it's good enough. That brings up a very important point about all of this. These ventilators are all very much compromised solutions. And it is very hard to get that compromise right between what's easy to build and make and reliable and good enough. There are other things that are not directly related to the pressures and volumes of air that's given to the patient, and that is the quality of the air. It is very important that you're not exposing the patient to incredibly dry air all the time, so there's got to be some way of making sure that the air presented to the patient is not only clean, but has sufficient moisture and probably has a measured amount of oxygen in it. Similarly, the other thing people are forgetting is, what do you do with the air afterwards? The air that the patient exhales probably has a lot of virus particles in it. You have to do something about that to make sure it doesn't infect everybody else in the room. And there are probably a number of ways one can handle that. One thing we've been looking at, for instance, is things like germicidal lamps to hopefully do away with some of the virus particles. We have no idea if that is the right way to do it at this point. So that's really the It Must Help section, and that's really why you need people like medical doctors involved. The second thing, and this is really now getting into my area of expertise, is it must be reliable, or it won't be able to help. In engineering, we often talk about the mean time between failure, something like that. And what that really means is, how likely is the device going to fail in a particular time? And we really need a mean time between failure of a month at least or more. Why is that important? Well, if it fails very often, you're going to put somebody's life at risk, of course. The other thing is, if it fails every 2 weeks, you're going to need a huge team of ventilator repair people. And in the end, you're going to spend all your time fixing ventilators as opposed to making more ventilators. And that's probably not a good situation. This may not seem like a very critical point until you look at this number. 20,000 is the number of breaths we do every day. The number of breaths your ventilator is going to have to do every day. And you might say, okay, no big deal. But the truth of the matter is, most items that we come across in everyday use are not rated for anywhere near those numbers of cycles. I'll give you a very quick example. Consider a light switch like you have in your home that you use to turn the kitchen light on and off. It's probably rated for something like 20 years. It's probably rated for something like 5 on-off switching cycles every day. And put those numbers together and you get something like 50,000, give or take, cycles. If we were to use that switch in our ventilator and have it switched once every time we do a breathing cycle, it means our ventilator probably won't last more than 2 or 3 days before it breaks down. Not a good situation. So you've got to be very careful about the long-term mean time between failure ratings of the parts. The other thing is, other parts that are made by things like 3D printers might be extremely good for prototyping. In fact, they generally are great for prototyping. But the big problem with a lot of 3D printers is the parts they make are not necessarily very robust or very strong, particularly from the cheaper printers. So if you're using a 3D part, consider that. Finally, the big question mark is the Resuscitator Bag. All these designs, including our simple design, use a Resuscitator bag. These bags are meant to be operated by hand. They're probably meant to be operated for 5 or 10 minutes or 15 minutes at a time while you're rushing a patient into a hospital or something like that. I have no idea how many times one of these bags can sustain a breathing cycle like we're talking about. Will it last a day? Will it only last half a day? One big test we have to do, and other groups have to do, is to see exactly how long one of those bags will last, and it's probably manufacturer dependent. And once we know that, we'll know whether these designs are viable or not. And if it turns out the bag does last for a reasonable amount of time, we'll be able to give users some sort of a guidance as to whether such a bag has to be replaced every 6 hours or 12 hours or 2 days or whatever the number is. So that is the whole reliability question. Or the final point is it easy to make? And if it's not easy to make, there's probably not much point in making a ventilator like this. Because if it's complicated to make and quite involved, we might as well just be building some more of the gold standard computer-controlled hospital ventilators that are in use everywhere today. So there are a few things we should need to consider if we're going to make a ventilator or design a ventilator that is in fact easy to make. And the first one is the parts that we're buying to make it. They need to be readily available, as generic as possible, and available, if at all possible, from multiple manufacturers. The good thing is you can often see on websites what's in stock and how much is in stock. So if you're looking at some sort of a switch for your ventilator and the manufacturer shows that it has 45,000 in stock, that's probably not a bad choice. If it shows that there are 45 in stock, well, maybe that's probably not the best choice for a switch. Same thing applies to every other part. The type of part may also depend a lot on where you are in the world. So if you're in Europe, for instance, you might choose things like screws and nuts and bolts with metric threads. And if you're in the United States, you might choose screws and nuts and bolts with threads that are not metric. Whatever is most commonly available where you are. The other thing is, you might not be thinking of this, but there's a whole aspect of design for manufacture. And what that means is, when you're designing something, you're not just designing it so it works, you're also designing it so that it's easy to build. This is normally done to making products as cheap as possible. In our case, we want to be able to build them as quickly as possible. And what that can, of course, mean is, one consideration is, how do you put the parts that you've designed together? It should be fairly easy. You shouldn't need to have to try and, with great effort, put a screw in somewhere that is blocked by every other part of the device and so forth. You can often do this just by making something bigger than you otherwise would. The other aspect is, what is it made out of? Because there are going to be some custom parts. And one choice of parts that a lot of people are not aware of is bent metal. A lot of things you have around your home, from things like satellite receivers to refrigerators, are made with bent metal, sheets of metal that have been cut and bent into certain shapes. This is in fact a very common way of manufacturing things, and the really neat thing is, virtually every city of any size, anywhere in the world today, has multiple shops that can do this, and they can do this cheaply, and they can do this rapidly. And that can be a very good way of building things in quantity, cheaply, and making a whole bunch of parts that are easy to assemble. The people who do this, by the way, can also be very helpful in giving you advice as to how to shape things to make them easy to make. and that can be critical. Always ask for help. We do it all the time. The other thing to consider is, of course, wood. Every city, everywhere has carpenters or other people who can do things with wood. Trouble with wood is, while everybody can build things out of wood, it will always take more time to build things out of wood than it will out of metal. So there is a bit of a consideration there. These companies that do things like this are called CMs, custom manufacturers, and again, they're available in every city. The other resource that can help you with this sort of thing are high-tech companies, because many high-tech companies that aren't software-only companies have to build things, and they have all sorts of people who not only know how to do this, they also know who all the companies are in your area that are the metal shops and so forth. So that's the easy to make point. So we've gone over those 3 critical points. We're going to make another video, and we're going to look at the design we've been working on, and we will critique it based on these points. And I would actually encourage you to take your own design or other people's designs and critique them based on those 3 points as well, because that's probably the first element of getting a design to the point where it might actually become a useful ventilator. And of course, the absolute best thing is, if you are designing something and you look at other people's designs, by all means, steal the best things they're doing to make your design even better, because what we want to do is save a lot of lives. Thank you.